Our next speaker, I'll get to my notes for a second, is Avril Ni Shearcaigh. Avril is our second speaker to speak on sustainable maritime transport. Avril is the manager of the Aran Islands Energy Co-op, which aims to make the Aran Islands self-sustainable and carbon neutral by 2022. The Energy Co-op is a community-owned energy cooperative on the Aran Islands in the mouth of Galway Bay. The residents of the three islands, Inishmore, Inishmaan, and Inisheer, are working towards becoming self-sufficient in locally generated renewable energy and free of the dependence of oil and gas by 2022. Significant targets. Avril, Giadich.
Cheers, Paul.
Over to you, Avril. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So as Paul said there, we are a community-owned energy co-op here on the island, and I suppose we firmly believe that the benefits of the energy transition and part of the just transition should be that communities benefit from it, and that we are at the forefront, that we have a say in our own energy, where it comes from, that we own some of our own energy, and we believe that hydrogen will be will have a huge role to play in the energy transition, not just on islands and in coastal areas, but in general. So firstly, I suppose today we're talking about what a community needs to become resilient. And I suppose that's almost like asking how long is a piece of string in one sense. But some of the things that came to mind to me were self-sufficiency, autonomy, a high rate of employment, and then that feeds into having industries and different industries available. I think we've seen with COVID lately that here in the Aran Islands, we depend quite heavily on tourism, and it's never great to have all your eggs in one basket in terms of only having one industry in an area and one source or one main source of employment. Communities also need to be adaptable, and we need to be able to move with the times and to change, to be that in the transition to clean energy or in other senses as well. We also need to have a young, thriving population. We need to keep people living in these communities. We need to ensure that it's attractive for young people to come and live, for families to remain on the islands or in coastal communities, and that they're not kind of forgotten about, as somebody said there in the comments. We need to have a good education and great services on the islands. And we also need to take part in innovation and to, I suppose, be very innovative. And islanders and people in coastal communities have, for a long time now, been very innovative and have had to be, I suppose. And sometimes necessity is the mother of all invention. So the last thing then, I suppose, as well, that all economies or all coastal communities or communities in general need is a very strong economy. And certainly renewables and energy will play a huge role in that. On that note, I'd like to just talk a little bit about this concept of the blue economy. And so that basically is very similar to the notion of the green economy, but specifically, I suppose, for coastal and maritime related issues. So in the last, I suppose, number of years, 5 or 6 years, this industry has grown considerably, and it is still growing at a very, very fast rate. The main elements there of that, I'm hoping you can all read that, the main elements there that are growing the fastest, I suppose, at present is offshore renewables, also shipbuilding and transport, as well as, I suppose, coastal tourism and things like that. And so as other industries grow and continue to grow, we see that the shipping industry worldwide grows as well to meet the demand as things are moving. The coastal economy is, and the blue economy employs over 5 million people in the EU at the moment. It generates over 500 billion per year, and it is, I suppose, a huge importance, particularly maybe to the coastal communities, where we may not always have the same opportunities in terms of employment and in terms of jobs and things like that as well. And then, as I suppose, just reiterating that point again, so as an island nation, our 7,007, this is talking about Ireland, our coastline is one of our greatest assets, and that goes for fishing, for aquaculture, tourism and leisure. And it's funny that in Ireland, over 1.9 million people actually live within 5 kilometres of the coast. And I'd say now, with COVID over the past year, everybody knows exactly what is within their 5 kilometres and are making full use of the coast and beaches and all those amenities that come with it. And are very, very lucky, all of those 1.9 million people, that they still have the coast at their disposal. Many coastal areas and islands have unique culture, they have unique heritage, and here in the Aran Islands and most of the coastal, or most of the last areas still speaking Irish on a day-to-day basis, are on the coast here in Ireland, and I'm sure that that is similar in other European countries as well. And many of these coastal areas and islands are also protected because of their unique landscape, and rightly so. So then coastal communities, I suppose, while we depend on tourism and things like that, the maritime industry really is vital for all communities. And mostly, I suppose, are mainly on islands, even more so than other communities on the coast. We depend on ferries as our source of public transport to access services. Everything is shipped into the island on cargo ferries, so be that goods and small items up to our cars, our everything. Fishing is also, in Ireland we have over 2,000 registered fishing vessels at the moment, and while on the fishing side of things, there may not be as many jobs as what there would have been historically, it's still a huge source of employment and income in coastal areas and in islands. Aquaculture in Europe also has a turnover of over 176 million. So it just shows, and this is growing all the time in terms of fish farming and, all of the coastal communities and islands are responsible for providing seafood and fish to the rest of the mainland and inland areas as well. And then tourism is closely linked to the maritime industry. So, everybody wants to head to the beach for their holidays or to head to the shore and head for the coast. And so we really do, those two industries are very, very closely tied together. Climate change is also, will have and is having huge impacts on coastal communities. We're seeing rising sea levels, coastal erosion, flooding. We also see a huge increase in extreme weather events, and this is having huge issues and I suppose is leaving us even more isolated. Then pollution and damage to aquatic life is also a huge issue that can be attributed to climate change. Maritime transports then, as important as they are to us all, unfortunately is responsible for over 940 million tonnes of CO2 annually. This accounts for over 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. These emissions could increase if things keep growing at the rate that they are now, up to 250% by the year 2050. And that's from the IMO's greenhouse gas study. That same study, funnily enough, also includes an objective to reduce shipping emissions by 50% by 2050. So in order to stop it growing 250% and actually reduce it 50%, it shows that something drastic needs to happen and a change is needed. While maritime transports might only be 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions or 13% of the overall EU greenhouse gas emissions, in coastal communities and in islands in particular, that figure is much higher. In 2017, we commissioned a study here on the Aran Islands that showed that maritime emissions, and in this we were only talking about the passenger ferries, so we're not including the fishing fleet, accounted for a huge percentage of our shipping emissions or our transport emissions. And you'll see there on the two islands, Oran and Inishmaan, that it is much, much higher than any other sector by far. Apologies now for all of the small text in this, but this is just to show, if you see up here at the top, that actually it's not only just much higher in terms of all of our overall transport, but the maritime or the ferries and their CO2 and their carbon footprint was actually much higher than any other industry on the islands by far. More than heating, more than transport, road transport on the islands combined. And this just shows that it does have a huge effect. And by tackling the ferries or the shipping sector, we will have make a huge impact in terms of our carbon footprint and reducing our dependence on fossil fuels. The challenge, I suppose, of doing that is that it's maybe not as simple as greening other sectors like road transport. And maybe that's why it's not quite at the same level as road transport is just yet. but we are on our way. We have much longer distances. It's much more difficult to locate refueling stations or somewhere to refuel. You're talking about, ships that travel thousands of miles. You also need much more pulling power, or an awful lot, much stronger vehicles and engines. And they also have to put up with rough seas or harsh conditions. And then there's also the issue of storage or space, where, having a large enough fuel cell to store all of the hydrogen needed for this journey, and transportation of the hydrogen as well from one area to another is an issue that isn't insurmountable, but it is a challenge nonetheless. The benefits then of maritime hydrogen, I suppose the social advantages would be that the communities, I suppose, because we're at the beginning of this transition, and in order for this transition to clean energy to be a just transition, communities should be at the forefront, and they should have a chance now to take part in the change. And hydrogen would allow people to control the sources of fuel that they use by having it locally or producing it locally. It would also encourage more employment, upskilling opportunities for people in these coastal areas, which would be a huge boost. There's also opportunities for making us more self-sufficient and autonomous, which is a huge, when we're talking about resilience and resilient communities, that is massive, and that is really what we need to encourage. And then helping to control the cost of transport, and having, I suppose, having control over that helps us to control the cost of living, because on islands and coastal areas, when you're that little bit more removed or isolated, the cost of living does increase. And some say that is the price that we pay for living in these beautiful areas, but it's still a challenge for people living in these places. So any way that we can help to mitigate that is great. The other thing then about hydrogen is that, unlike vehicles or road vehicles, ships are not built in bulk, so they can be tailor-made for their specific purpose. Hydrogen, as we saw with Irina's presentation, can be used in lots of different ways, be it in fuel cells or in other ways. So you can, I suppose, when building a ship or building a ferry or building a fishing boat, you have the opportunity to really tailor make it for its intended purpose. And therefore hydrogen can be, I suppose, it's very versatile is what I'm trying to say. So hydrogen can help us in order to green the maritime industry and to reduce the emissions of our shipping fleet or fishing fleet or whatever it may be. More and more experts agree that hydrogen is now going to play a very important role in greening maritime transport worldwide, and indeed in the transition to clean energy in general. This is great because I suppose 5 or 10 years ago, there was no mention of hydrogen anywhere. And slowly we've been working with the Irish government, who are now seen to be coming around to the idea. And it's just fantastic to see that there's so much happening in hydrogen at the moment. We are involved in both the huge projects and the sea fuel project, so it's something that we have been investigating and looking at for the last number of years. But there's a huge amount of work all around the country and all around Europe, and indeed around the world in hydrogen at the moment. And I really do think that it is going to really take off. Hydrogen is, like I said, it is very versatile, and there are many examples of hydrogen vessels already built or are being built that are using hydrogen in different ways, and that are being tested worldwide. So just to give you an idea, I suppose they vary hugely, from the very luxurious like this one, which is a yacht built by a French company called Hynova. This is an electric engine which is driven by hydrogen, which is stored on board the vessel. And then we also have an American version here, which is the Golden Gate Zero Emission Marine. They have built, or they will be launching next year, a boat called the Water Go Round, which will be the first fuel cell vessel in the US, but it'll also be the first commercial fuel cell ferry in the world. And I mean, 2021, this year I should say, not next year, is we're right on the cusp of it now. A lot of this research has been done already, and we really are ready to move on to the next stage. This is a Japanese one then, so there's a fishing vessel which is being powered by a Toyota fuel cell. They're going to be testing that in 2022, and I think that would be something that coastal communities, especially the fishing fleet, would be very interested in keeping an eye on. Kawasaki then have actually, so this isn't a hydrogen ship per se, but it is a shipping vessel especially designed to transport hydrogen. And so this particular one is designed to be able to transport liquefied hydrogen over 9,000 kilometers. And so that then reduces or helps tackle the challenge of transporting hydrogen and moving it around in order for it to reach all of these isolated areas or peripheral areas. Although, like I said, we would ideally be producing at least some of it here ourselves. And then we also have a bit closer to home here, and something that we've been looking or keeping an eye on is the Hydine project in Orkney. So this is a 1-year project, and they're adapting an existing roll-on, roll-off passenger ferry with hydrogen injectors. So this is, I suppose, an easier transition for existing ferries or existing boats, and a very versatile and useful way for them to use hydrogen, and something that is very accessible and that can be done quite easily. As I'll just finish up then by talking about the Aran Islands case study. So as part of the huge project, we are focusing on the ferries, so the passenger ferries and the cargo ferries here on the islands. We're at a very early stage of our case study, it must be said, but we are engaging with the local ferry company owners, and there is an interest in learning about hydrogen, how it could be applied to the Aran case. Because, like I said, these ships aren't built in bulk, and it is a very I suppose niche thing, and everything should be, in our case at least, would need to be, I suppose, built for purpose or looking specifically at the purpose here on the islands. We have maybe longer journeys than some of the rest of the Irish islands, but they could be very, very short in comparison to other areas too, and there is no one size fits all. We're assessing then the amount of renewable energy required to produce enough hydrogen for the ferries, the cargo and the passenger ferries here in the islands. We're looking at the business case for the ferry companies, because at the end of the day, that is their bottom line. They're not solely responsible for transitioning to clean energy and reducing the carbon footprint of the islands. And at the end of the day, that is their lookout. And so we're working with them on what the business case is for hydrogen, how it compares, and what things could look like for them going forward. And then we're looking at it from the point of view that it could also be rolled out across all of the Irish islands, and maybe even further afield. Once we have a solution, I suppose, adapted for here, it would be very easy to roll that out in other similar areas. And so I'm very excited to see how we progress that going forward. I think that's all from me, unless there are any questions.
Avril, thank you very much indeed. We have a few questions for you. Don't get off late. There's no such thing as a free lunch. A couple of questions coming up, and there was something that we talked about with yourself just before the webinar itself. You did a CO2 study on the ferries to the islands. Could you give us the data on that? And it would reinforce something that Michael Cecil has posted up here from Rathbun.
Yeah, so in 2017, we did an energy master plan here on the islands. And so we looked at the energy baseline. And what that showed was that the ferries, and this didn't include, when we're talking about maritime diesel in the study, that didn't include ferries. It was just looking at, it didn't include the fishing fleet. It was just looking at the passenger ferries. And it showed that the carbon footprint of the ferries was actually much higher than anything else combined across the island. So it was more than heat, it was more than road transport combined across all of the islands. That the ferries actually had the biggest carbon footprint, and by tackling the ferries and by eliminating their dependency on fossil fuels, we would be a huge way on the road towards eliminating our dependency on fossil fuels here in the islands. And I mean, that's before we look at heat or at road transport, which is amazing.
Excellent. Another question is from Michael O'Mahony, and he said he doesn't see a conflict of interest with large companies becoming involved with communities. Is there any work that you're doing with large companies such as ESB or that for interaction to make sure there's a commercial sustainability for the energy future?
I suppose there's an ongoing difficulty between communities and large companies. We see that in terms of I suppose the government are now, the Irish government anyway, are a little bit delayed, but they have finally agreed, I suppose, and have recognised that communities have a huge role to play and will have a huge role to play in the energy transition. The Renewable Energy Support Scheme now has a section for communities, this has been fought by the big developers and by the big companies, to be honest, for years and years, and they haven't wanted communities to come in and take over their patch. And I don't think that could ever happen. I don't think communities can compete with developers or big corporations on that level. But at the same time, there doesn't seem to be, just yet at least, there doesn't seem to be that openness and that willingness from a lot of the corporations to allow communities to participate and to actually, I suppose, own their own energy or have their say. And that's something that needs to change, in my opinion.
Excellent. Because there's an opportunity there for the financial might, as you said, of the larger companies, but they need that corporate social responsibility to change in order to engage with community and share.
Yeah.
One final question. As an island off an island off an island of Europe, how remote is the energy need, or how remote is the energy opportunity for the Aran Islands, Inishmore, Inishmaan, and Inisheer?
I suppose we're very lucky that we are connected to the mainland grid, electricity grid. We are, I suppose, very isolated, and we're the furthest island off the coast. We have I think it's around a 9-mile journey to the mainland from the islands here. So we are quite isolated. We are in the periphery in that sense. But I think we are very close. We have great community support here in terms of generating our own energy, in terms of becoming self-sufficient and reducing our carbon footprint. And I think that we have, while we might be isolated in that in the logistical sense or geographical sense, we are well on our way to tackling climate change, and we're, I suppose, leading and hoping to lead islands. And I think that's recognised at an EU level, that islands are going to lead, and that islands are the perfect place to showcase the different technologies that can be used and then can be, I suppose, rolled out and expanded into larger communities and larger areas.
Excellent. Avril, and thank you very much indeed for your presentation. Hopefully, as we said, the diversity in today's presenters, not just geographically but commercially, will give an interesting audience and input